Welcome back. Today we will look at chapter 4 of your textbook. Chapter 4 is mainly about trying to understand how the market works. And we will develop a very simple model of market where we are going to develop something called a demand curve that will characterize the behavior of the consumer or the buyer, and a supply curve which will characterize the behavior of the suppliers. And we use that model of demand and supply to understand how the prices of goods and services are being determined. Now, one question that we are going to start with today, which sort of acts as a motivation, is why does tuition keep rising? Are there market forces that can tell us how or in what direction the price of the education, which is tuition fee, is going to change? We would like to believe that it will, and with that objective we want to develop a model of demand and supply. When we compare, after we finish this chapter, we will be able to distinguish between quantity demanded and demand, explain the basic determinants of demand, distinguish between quantity supplied and supply, explain what determines the supply, then explain how demand and supply determines price and quantity in a market, and explain the effect of changes in demand and supply. So three very important things. We are going to first define the demand side of the market, which really captures the behavior of the consumers, and then we are going to define the supply curve, which characterizes the behavior of the suppliers in the market or producers, and then we are going to bring those together and we're going to define a market demand. Before we start looking at that market, obviously we are going to mention we are going to have some underlying assumption as what kind of markets we are looking at. A market, as we know, is a place that brings the buyer and the sellers together. That is true for the market for cattle. That is also true for the market for stock. Every market brings the buyer and the seller in the same place. But not all markets are the same. Some markets have physical structure like a cattle market or Walmart, which is a market itself, and some markets can be virtual. Also, the number of buyers and sellers could be also different, right? Imagine there is a market for paintings where the number of paintings that are being sold could be just simply one, like Mona Lisa, and there could be a large number of buyers willing to buy that. At the same time, you can think about a single buyer, let's say the person who wants to buy a very expensive car, and there could be multiple producers willing to supply that. So the size of the buyer and the seller could be very different in different markets. And your slides is looking at several different kinds of markets, right? And market for running shoes, that's one kind of market. Then market for coffee and bagels. So all these are different kind of market, and before we start, we want to really make some assumptions about the kind of markets that we're going to be looking at. More importantly, we are mainly going to talk about something called a competitive market, a very important idea. A competitive market is a market that has a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. We make this assumption about market being competitive because it eliminates a lot of problems that we are going to encounter in future chapters. So for the time being, our market is competitive in the sense that the number of buyers and the number of sellers are identical, and that sort of solves our problem. Many of our problems that we are going to encounter later. Okay, so we are going to start with a market that is competitive, large number of buyers, large number of sellers. For the sake of simplicity, we are going to just simply assume that there is only one product that the group of buyers are willing to buy and the group of producers are willing to sell. the idea of a competitive market also has several other important issues. First of all, whenever you are, and let me just go back, whenever we are going to be using a competitive market, there are several things that we assume. We first assume that that our the number of buyers and number of sellers are large, and we also assume that producers produce something called homogeneous products, homogeneous NOUS goods. Homogeneous goods means the kind of products that they all produce are kind of identical to each other. That is kind of important because if you are in a market where although there is one product but different producers are producing some variation of that, it is very difficult to really understand that. And in due time, we are going to look at situations where the market is not producing homogeneous products. Another assumption that we're going to make is that since the buyers are large, producers are also large, there are many buyers and many producers, we will sort of argue that none can control the market price, meaning that if the market price that we are none can control the price, which means that in this market the price is going to be sort of controlled through an interaction between the buyer and the seller, something that is going to be very important. One can argue that if you are in a market where the buyer and the seller, either of them has some undue control over the market, it's very difficult to understand how the consumer and the producer responds in that kind of setup. We will be looking at markets where the buyer and the seller, or the buyer themselves or the seller themselves can have some undue control, but that's in the future. So without further delay, let's start defining the consumer side of this market or the buyer side of this market. The buyer side of this market is going to be mainly characterized in the context of what we call a demand. When we talk about demand, there are two definitions that always comes into our mind. One is this called a quantity demanded. This is the amount of goods and services or resources that people are willing and able to buy during a specific period at a specified price. So what it means is that quantity demanded really tells you how much you are willing to buy at a given price, right? This is an important idea. So it would be like, if I ask you, if I stop you inside of a market and randomly ask you, hey, if the price of this good is this, how much would you be willing to buy? The numbers that you tell me is your quantity demanded. Now, with quantity demanded, we now are going to define something that is very critical for this chapter and also very important for your exam. It is called this idea of law of demand. Law of demand is a very, very important theory. It argues that other things remaining the same, if the price of the good rises, the quantity demanded of that good decreases. Notice that it is talking about sort of like a negative relationship between price and how much of the good you buy, right? So if you are thinking about price being rising, so I just wanted to highlight that, but I could not, but that's fine. So we are mainly thinking about a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. We are saying that whenever price increases, you probably want to buy less of that. And I think it makes perfect sense because, if something is more expensive, you are saying to yourself, hey, this is expensive, I have limited resources, I really cannot buy a lot of it. So law of demand, therefore, I think makes a lot of sense. The opposite is also obviously true. If the price of a good falls, we should be expecting excuse me. The opposite is obviously true. If the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded for that good increases. So again, a negative relationship. So we can say that the following relationship really characterizes law of demand. let's say P is price and QD is your quantity demanded, the amount that you want to buy. The relationship between them is negative. Okay, so whenever price increases, your demand for your demand for that good really goes down. Right? So so let me go back again. So the price is the relationship between price and quantity demanded is negative. So that sort of in one line defines what the law of demand is. Okay, now let's start seriously thinking about how we can represent this idea of a demand. Demand is very important because demand characterizes the behavior of the consumers. Demand tells you, when certain market conditions changes, how do the buyers' behavior change, and this is important because at the end of this chapter, we would like to be able to develop a graphical model that is simple enough to help us, answer many, market-related questions. So one way to represent our demand is by developing this idea of a demand schedule and then correspondingly develop something called a demand curve. So demand is a relationship between quantity demanded and the price of a good when all other influences remain unsame. So demand can be illustrated by a demand schedule or a demand curve. A demand schedule is a list of quantities demanded at each different price when all other influences of buying remains the same. The demand curve is just a graphical interpretation of that. I leave you to sort of spend some time looking at the particular demand schedule, which is on the left side. You notice that the demand schedule mainly gives you the different relationship between price and quantity demanded. At different prices, you buy different quantity. Notice that as your price goes down, your quantity demanded is increasing, right? Price is going down from 2 to 150, your quantity demanded is going up, right? So that's the law of demand. When we plot these same points, like A here, B there, you can see that the C really corresponds to that C, D corresponds to that D. You get something like a demand curve, right? It's a downward sloping demand curve, and like this one. And this is called a demand curve. So the demand schedule, which is this one, and the demand curve provide you with the same information, right? Okay. Now, what we just looked at was an individual demand curve, meaning that we just looked at, at different prices, how much would a typical individual be willing to buy, right? So if that is the individual demand, from there we can go to market demand, which is simply a sum of individual demands from the market, right? So it is probably more instructive to just to look at the graphical illustration. The graphical illustration is very simple. Imagine that there are two guys, there is Tina and there is Tim. At when the market price is $1.50, Tina's demand is 1. When the market price is $1.50, Tim's demand is 0. So when we get the market demand, we just sum up Tina's demand and Tim's demand. So when the market price is $1, notice that when the market price is $1, Tim's demand is just 1, right? Because it's 1 plus 0, so that's that. So that would be Tim's market demand. And so when market price is $1, Tina's demand is 2 units, Tim's demand is 1 unit. So when the market price is $1, the market demand is actually 3. So that's 1 point on the market demand. So you're going to have points like this. When you add, you're going to get the market demand, and these are individual demand, right? So the market demand is just a horizontal sum of individual demand curves. Okay. So simple idea. So you can, if you can find the market demand, you can obviously find the if you can find the individual demand curve, you can also find the market demand. Okay, now comes the most critical part of this discussion. Now we would like to spend some time trying to understand the factors that really change our demand. So what do we mean by a change in demand? Okay. Before we start, we want to understand the distinction between change in demand and change in quantity demanded. So we are going to say that change in demand is going to be represented by a rightward or a leftward shift of the demand curve. Okay, what does that mean? It means that whenever there is a change in demand, it would mean that at a given price, the amount that you want to buy changes. So imagine, again, I want to take some, imagine that the original market price, this is too, so let me just, okay, so let me just redraw that. Imagine that you had 3 demand curves and the original demand curve is the middle one, and then I want to go back again. Let's say this is the original demand curve. At price P1, you are willing to buy Q1. Suddenly, for some reason, at price P1, you are willing to buy Q2. So that would be represented by a rightward shift of the demand curve, or at P1, you are willing to buy Q3. That would be represented by a leftward shift of the demand curve. Whenever the demand curve shifts to the right or shifts to the left, this is called a change in demand, which is very much different from something called a change in quantity demanded. So change in demand, you can read the definition by yourself. We also want to look at a change in quantity demanded. A change in quantity demanded could be so that's like a change in demand. So whenever demand curve shifts to the left, you call it a decrease in demand. Whenever demand curve shifts to the right, you probably call it an increase in demand. A change in demand is going to be when the price of a good changes. Let's say the price of a good changes from $1.50 to 50. You can see that your quantity demanded changes from Q1 to Q2. So a movement, so let's say, so whenever price changes from $1.50 to just 50 cents, you move from point A to point B, and your quantity demanded changes from Q1 to Q2. So therefore, a change in quantity demanded is when you stay on the same demand curve but move from one point of the demand curves, let's say A to point B. A change in demand, on the other hand, would be a rightward shift of the demand curve or a leftward shift of the demand curve, depending on how your demand is changing. So, with this distinction between change in demand and change in quantity demanded, we are now going to look at different factors that change your demand. Okay, so let us try to get a background behind this demand curve. This simple demand curve is actually quite a critical component of our market. So our demand curve shows at what price, at different prices, how much we are willing to buy. Let's go back and try to understand this. Let's say I am looking at a demand curve for milk, and I see whenever the price of milk goes up, I buy less of milk, and so on. Okay, so what determines my demand for milk, or why do I buy milk anyway? Economists argue that there are a series of factors that affect my demand. The most important of them is the income. Notice that I'm not talking about prices to begin with, because we all know that prices affect the demand curve nonetheless. But whenever prices change, it doesn't cause a change in demand, but it causes a change in quantity demanded. We want to understand the change in demand. So a change in demand will be whenever there's an increase in income or a decrease in income, whenever there's a change in income. So why is this so important? So let's imagine that our income is suddenly increasing. So if my income increases, I I am going to feel richer, right? And I'm going to say, well, if my income has gone up, I can now afford more of the same goods. So and then if I am so if my income, so let me go a couple of steps back. Let's start with the one that is price of related goods, so that I am consistent with the slides and you can follow me. Goods in our market are really connected in two ways. Goods could be substitute in a market, meaning that you can buy one good in the place of the other good. There are a lot of goods in our market that are substitute goods. Example of substitute good could be Coke and Pepsi, right? Unless you are a big Coke or Pepsi fan, to you they are virtually the same, and they have the same color, same price. At the same time, so these are example of substitute goods. Also, there are examples like orange and apples, which I don't think is a good example. The important issue is the following: if the demand for a good increases, the demand for a good increases if the price of the substitute rises. So imagine this: imagine the price of Coke is going up, right? Okay, so if the price of Coke goes up, let's imagine that this is the demand curve for Coke. Price was, let's say, P1. Quantity demand was Q1. Now price has gone up to Q2. Quantity demanded goes down to Q2. So which means that whenever the price of Coke goes up, people buy less Coke according to law of demand. Now, if price of Coke goes up and the demand for quantity demanded for Coke goes down, what happens to the demand for Pepsi? For Pepsi, we argue that if Pepsi and Coke are substitutes with the same price of Pepsi, the demand for Pepsi is now gonna go up. It's gonna it is going to shift to the right. Why is that? When the price of Coke increased from P1 to P2, people are buying less Coke, which means that some people are desperately in need of buying a soft drinks, and they find Pepsi to be a cheaper alternative or substitute, and they buy more Pepsi. So an increase in the price of Coke leads to an increase in demand for Pepsi. Okay, that's number one. On the other hand, you can have goods which are complementary goods. An example of a complementary good could be sugar and coffee, because you buy them together. They are not substitutes; they are complementary. So now let's imagine that the price. Let's imagine that the price of sugar increases. So if the price of sugar increases, we know again that the demand, let's say price of sugar goes up from P1 to P2, quantity demanded for sugar goes down. So that's okay. Now we want to understand how the price change of sugar affects our demand for coffee. Okay. Okay. Let me draw it again. So so I am looking at I apologize, it's creating a bit of problem. Okay, so price of sugar, so this is price of sugar increasing, so this is sugar. Price increases from P1 to P2, quantity demanded goes down from P1 to Q1 to Q2. So if that happens, I want to understand the price of the market for coffee. Okay, so remember, the price of coffee did not change, the price of sugar just went up. So if the price of coffee goes up from goes up from P1 to P2, I buy less sugar. So economics argues that if I buy less sugar, I buy less coffee because they are complementary. So what will happen, although the price of coffee did not change, let's say it's P star, the demand curve shifts to the left, and as a result, quantity demanded goes down from Q2 to Q1. So whenever there is an increase in the price of sugar, demand for coffee goes down. Okay, so price of sugar increases and demand for coffee demand goes down. So that's like a relationship between complementary goods and how the price of a complementary good affects the demand for the other good, right? So we just looked at price of related goods. The second factor is the expected future price. So let's try to understand this. So so I expect the price of, let's say, rice to go up in the future. So what do I do today? We would argue that if I expect the price of rice to go up in the future, and I like rice a lot, I have to buy rice, so I'm gonna buy more rice today. Okay, if the expected price of rice goes up, so I'm expecting in the future price of rice is gonna go up, so I want to make sure that in the future I will have sufficient rice, so I'm gonna buy extra amount of rice today, so that when tomorrow comes, I have my rice. So expected future price therefore affects the demand as well. Okay, so that's important. Now income is kind of important. When income increases, you should generally expect the demand to go up, meaning that whenever my income increases, everyone thinks that they are richer, so everyone feels like they want to buy more of that. But that's actually not true for all cases, because in economics we argue that not all goods are the same. We regularly distinguish between two kinds of goods. One good is what we call a normal good. This is a good for which, as our income increases, we buy more of that. Most of the goods really fall into that category. You can name like sugar to milk to almost everything in your life. If you think about it, if the more income you have, the more more of that goods you want to buy. So they are normal goods. But then there are some exceptional goods which are kind of strange, and I think we need to really think about some examples. Before we talk about those examples, I would like to talk about the exact definition of that good and an example of that good. So these goods are called inferior goods. These are goods for which if your income increases, you actually buy less of that good. Very strange, right? Do we have a real life example of that? My students always give me example about ramen noodles. Ramen noodles, very cheap. When you are poor, you are an undergraduate student, you buy a lot of ramen noodles. When you graduate, you get a job and you stop buying that. So ramen noodles could be an inferior good, right? When income increases, you buy less of that good. Non-generic brand jeans could be an inferior good. As your income increases, you tell yourself that I can now buy branded jeans. So on. So okay. So expected future income and credit, that's also very interesting. So you are thinking that in the future your income might go up. So what do you do today? This idea is critical because in the second component of this course, we are going to talk about savings. Savings and how much we buy from the market are intrinsically connected. if my future expected income go up, people know that in the future they are going to be richer, so they say, hey, I don't have to save as much money that I wanted to save before, because I know that in the future my income is going to go up. So if future income goes up, you are going to buy more today, so your demand is going to go up. Also, if you feel like, or if you have an expectation that in the future getting credit is going to be easier, so then you're going to say that, well, if getting credit is easier to, in the future, I'll be able to easily borrow, so I don't really need to save as much as I was planning to do. So I'll just, spend more money and I'll buy more. So expected future income and expected future credit also affects your demand, in the sense that it increases your demand. Okay, number of buyers is important, right? Why? Because if the number of buyers increases, the market demand increases. It's a no-brainer, so I'm gonna skip that. Preferences, something that is actually very critical when we look at demand. I want to start with an example. If you remember, if any of you remember, there was this thing called mad cow disease in the 1990s. Mad cow disease was a very serious issue. DISEASE. So what happened with mad cow disease was that anyone who bought meat in Europe in the 1990s contracted this disease, and people were really scared. So during the height of this phobia in the 1992, 93, the price of meat, beef specifically, went down dramatically in Europe. Were people buying more meat then because meat was cheaper? The answer is no. People were afraid and they were buying less of meat, although the price of meat was going down. The similar things happened in the early 2000s, where people suddenly changed their taste towards sweetening products. If you remember, Dunkin' Donuts really filed for bankruptcy in around 2002, 2003, because nobody was buying them, because people suddenly became conscious for their health. So there was a lot of demand for healthy products. So preferences can change, taste can change. And taste, when you think about it, it's kind of important. It's probably the most important thing about your market activities. Okay, so preferences can change for various reasons. You can take a look at that, and then we're gonna now. So that sort of like summarizes all the factors that affect our demand. I'm going to conclude this lecture by talking about changes in demand and changes in the quantity demanded, which I already covered. Just to remember that changes in demand is going to be when you are moving from one point, let's say from 1 to 2, from one part of the demand curve to another part. That would be a movement in the demand curve or a change in quantity demanded. Whenever you move from 1 to 3 or 2 to 3, that is going to be a change in demand. So please remember that. So that sort of concludes my first class lecture.